thing. Oh, there we go.
Stan, we're live.
Hey, thank you, Larry, the Liberty Guy. This is Mike Stenhouse on another edition of In the Dugout. Good to be back with you. We had a couple of days of repeat In the Dugout sessions. I was away. You might notice a little pink on the face. Was away for a 5-day golf trip, and it was nice and sunny and warm in Williamsburg, Virginia. I'm not a good golfer, but I went and I needed to have all of it. I mean, like you, right? How many vacations did we cancel last year in the past year? I think I counted 5 trips I canceled. 3 of them were vacations. 2 of them were business trips. So I went out with a buddy. We did a little golfing, and we're back, and I'm happy to be back in the dugout with you today. All right. Lot to talk about, as always. Judge Robert Flanders, former Supreme Court Justice in Rhode Island and former senatorial candidate, will join us shortly to talk about the U.S. Supreme Court packing. Apparently, the legislation that Democrats in Congress will be introducing as part of their plan to fundamentally change America. So we'll talk to Judge Flanders on that. We'll also talk to the judge about the legality of this requirement that many school districts are having to test student athletes. A lot of parents outraged about that, and we'll find out if they might have some legal grounds. I'm going to start with some commentary first on a bill that I'll be actually testifying on later today, a rule that would end what we've called these dictatorial emergency management under these executive orders that just go on and on and on and on and unchallenged by anybody in the General Assembly, which has the right to do it. So it's a bill that would actually require the General Assembly to become engaged. So I'll be testifying in support of that bill, and just after our show ends, when the committee hearing begins, and then some commentary on President Biden's plans, which is really, if you look, and we'll talk about this, but if you look at it in its totality, everything they're doing, it's really a continuation of Obama's plan to fundamentally change America. A lot of us don't want to fundamentally change America. We've got some issues to fix. We don't need fundamental change. America's done quite fine. We've had some blemishes on our history. Yeah. So since we're in the dugout, I'm going to wear my cap of the USS Ronald Reagan that a veteran gave me many, many years ago when he was on service on that ship. And because Ronald Reagan fundamentally loved America. He didn't want to fundamentally change it like Biden and Obama and the Democrats up there want to. Later on today, later on the show, the bottom of the hour, as is our Thursday tradition, we'll have Dr. Andrew Bostom. And he's going to talk about, how he thinks that the state of Rhode Island and many other, I don't know about the CDC, but certainly the state of Rhode Island is downplaying this pause to the J&J vaccine. He thinks it's a potentially serious medical issue. And he was disgusted, I think to use his words, at how our health director today, Dr. Nicole Alexander Scott, downplayed the potential risk of this J&J vaccine. So we'll talk to him about that. We'll go through Rhode Island stats, and we'll talk about all things COVID. Okay. A little batting practice, which means we'll just do some quick hits on some topics before we get into the meat of our discussions today. All right, today is April 15th. Traditionally, it's tax day, but I think, as you know, I think I'm right in saying this, that the deadline is not April 15th, it's now May 15th. So we got an extra month, and I needed that. I went away on my golf trip, and I wouldn't have met the April 15th deadline. But here's the IRS. This is sort of a take on cancel culture. Snoopy writing to cancel his subscription to the IRS, meaning I don't want to pay any more of these crazy taxes, especially if you're going to raise them. My interpretation, especially if you're going to raise them the way that Biden and everybody wants to. So just a little fun one. All right, a little bit more on. I've talked to you about my disgust with Major League Baseball and their wokeness and canceling the All-Star game out of Atlanta and moving it somewhere else. And this was a great article. You can see here, Mary Anastasia. I believe this was in the Wall Street Journal. And Major League Baseball says that, the Georgia voting rules violated their values, as you can see up here. But yet they're having deals, and they're working closely with communist Cuba to make sure that the flow of Cuban talent continues into American and Major League Baseball and professional baseball. What about the communist values of Cuba? Those don't matter, of course, right? I mean, again, you see the hypocrisy of the left in everything it does. You see how the media lets them get away with all of this stuff. And it's unbelievable. I mean, President Obama, you can see here, as it mentioned in 2016, really opened up sports and travel and other items with communist Cuba, even with Fidel Castro gone. But on Major League Baseball, working on an agreement with them, but Trump basically shut all that down. One of my best friends from college was his father grew up in communist Cuba, fled. They tried to persecute him still here in America. What a major human rights violator Cuba is, but baseball doesn't care. Apparently, Major League Baseball doesn't care about those values. I mean, come on, give me a break. So still haven't watched a Red Sox game or any baseball game since the first 7 innings of opening night when I heard the news. I guess they're on quite a winning streak, I think, if I'm following it properly. They lost their first 3. Now they won, 9 in a row? Is that right? I think that's what I'm seeing. So good for the Red Sox, but I'm not going to be watching. I don't know about you guys. Put your comment in there in YouTube if you're watching. Are you watching Major League Baseball right now? Or are you taking a timeout, or are you canceling them totally? What are you doing? All right, more disappointing, news out of the General Assembly and Governor McKee's office as far as legislation. Governor McKee, the General Assembly passes. There's a whole bunch of bills that have been around in the General Assembly for years, and I might have to correct myself, or I'm not going to apologize, but maybe former Speaker Mattiello was a little bit more of a firewall against the progressive left. And we thought, because this year with Speaker Joseph Shekarchi, bills that have been hung up in the General Assembly for years in the past are now sailing through. And I'm talking about crazy bills, bad bills. We saw the Act on Climate bill pass, get signed into law by McKee. A big disappointment, raising costs on businesses and on families. He cannot claim he's an advocate for small business if he passes a bill like that. And then he did it again today. He signed another bill, got through the General Assembly, and another bill was signed into law by Governor McKee. And the way they position these bills is just crazy. They had a bill supposedly to end discrimination in rental housing. The bill says, the way the advocates talk about is if you're on Section 8, which means you're getting some kind of housing credits from the federal government and from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, that you can't be turned away by a landlord, or else that landlord could be subject to a lawsuit. Well, they passed a bill that basically put that into effect today. and the governor signed it in. It's another anti-small business, in this case, anti-landlord bill. I mean, in Providence and then in this state, we face some of the highest property taxes and regulations anyway in the nation. And now they're putting these extra handcuffs on landlords that will subject them to lawsuits if they don't accept Section 8 applicants. Now, the reason they're not accepting them is not that they're discriminating against minorities, as the bill proponents say. It's because when you accept a Section 8 renter, you now have to go through all kinds of bureaucratic and administrative bullshit with the federal government. You now have to start answering questions to them, and you opening yourself up to inspections from them. And it's not that these landlords are looking to discriminate against anybody. I've talked to them. We've talked about it on this show. We've put out testimony. We've put out reports on this. It's just that a lot of these landlords just don't want to deal with the federal government and all the red tape that goes along with that. And that comes when you accept just like if you're a provider and you accept a Medicaid or client in this state for whatever service you provide, that opens you up to a whole nother level of bureaucracy and red tape that you just don't, if you're a small business owner, you just don't want to deal with. Now you got to go hire somebody or spend extra time. So again, Dan McKee happily signs this ignorantly, or at least on the surface, doesn't recognize the potential burden this will place on landlords who are just struggling right now, right? Especially in Providence with these high property taxes. So again, another anti-business bill gleefully signed by Governor McKee. I just don't get it. All right, we should have Judge Flanders joining us shortly, but and I'll segue by talking about something that will be of interest. That he has a vested interest in as well, or at least a testimonial interest. So we've talked often on this show how the General Assembly during this pandemic, during this emergency management time, this emergency government, these emergency executive orders that have been going unchallenged, how the General Assembly has been negligent in providing any oversight, any debate about whether or not what we've been calling dictatorial executive branch rule should continue. We're not in an emergency anymore. We still have a pandemic out there, but its severity is no worse than the flu, no worse than car crashes, worse than drug overdoses or people dying of lung cancer or whatever it is, than many other afflictions that are in our society. There's no need for executive management anymore, and there hasn't been for a while. But what came up today, and I want to give some credit to Matt Allen on his radio show, and I was on his show today. What he discovered is that McKee said, "Well, we're extending the emergency management not because of medical reasons, but because we want to keep federal dollars flowing in that come with that declared state of emergency." What? Think about that. We're limiting businesses. People are losing their jobs. People are losing their businesses. Students aren't learning. We saw the headline in today's Providence Journal. We have record numbers of overdoses from kids and other people depressed from being locked down and drinking, whether it's drug or alcohol overdoses. We're suffering all this. Businesses and the people are suffering because the federal government, because the Rhode Island government wants a few extra dollars from the federal government. Now, Dan McKee said that. Matt Allen contacted the governor's office, and they sent back an email largely confirming that. Then they didn't confirm that was the whole reason, but they were saying, yes, there's a lot of federal dollars at stake. Well, see, this is a question that needs to be debated. This is why the General Assembly needs to exert its powers and decide whether or not to extend these states of emergency. And in deciding that, guess what? They have to have public debate, right? The General Assembly is not going to take a vote on anything till there's a floor debate or a committee debate or something. And questions like this can come up. Wait a minute. What is the science behind why you say we have to extend the state of emergency or this particular executive order or that one? And are you doing it solely for the money, or are you doing it for medical reasons? I mean, these are vital questions, and the results of those questions could influence these executive orders that have had such tremendous impact on our lives. So the legislation that I'll be testifying today, and our guest Judge Flanders, who I'll bring on in just a second, has written some testimony for, basically supports the Senate Bill 255 that would require the General Assembly to weigh in to approve or not approve any extension past the original 30 days of a state of emergency or of an executive order. I'll be testifying on that. You can go watch it on Capitol TV if you want, sometime after 5 o'clock. And the judge has submitted his testimony. And speaking of which, I see the good judge. He always corrects me as a former judge, but to me, he's the judge. And so we're going to call him the judge. And there he is, Judge Robert Flanders. Judge, welcome back to In the Dugout.
Delighted to be here, Mike.
And I see you're playing you're good sport. What cap you got on today to join me?
This is my Dunes Club tennis cap. Looking forward to getting out on the clay courts and giving my legs a break from a winter of hardcore tennis. So yeah, happy that the weather is now finally cooperating, and hopefully I can play on a mask-free basis in the not too distant future.
Oh, wow. Well, if the bill passes today, well, maybe the General Assembly step in and can contravene those mask mandates. So
yes,
we'll see. All right. Well, what we want to talk, well, first of all, just on tennis. So clay courts are a lot easier on the legs than hard courts?
oh my, you have no idea. Yes, absolutely, especially when you get to my dotage age, trying to serve and volley and stopping short on a hard court is a lot more trying on the joints than the clay court.
All right. So, I hate to make this partisan, but I don't know any other way to say it. The Democrats in Congress, the U.S. Congress, are fundamentally seeking to change America, I think, in the way that Barack Obama, originally talked about it. You think of the voting bill that would make it easier to cheat, the anti-Second Amendment push. You think of there's a labor bill that would give the labor unions such massive advantages and special handouts, the Green New Deal, all these energy mandates that are coming, the open borders, the cancel culture where government is aligning itself with big tech and big business to cancel people. And now they want to fundamentally change the Supreme Court by adding 4 new seats, liberal seats, which would give them a 7-6 advantage, depending on how you consider Judge Roberts. Anyway, just initial thoughts, Judge, on what's going on here.
Well, this is part of a long-standing effort to bend the court to the will of the left, led by none other than Sheldon Whitehouse and Dick Durbin and others in the Senate, who are trying to let the court know that if they don't start ruling in ways that are more akin to the results they want to achieve, then they're going to start messing with the structural integrity of the court by packing it with judges that President Biden would appoint to fill the 4 additional slots that they're now talking about, or putting term limits or other ways of mandatory retirement. All of these threats are directed to try and persuade the court that if they want to continue as they have been now for well over 100 years, with not only 9 judges and with lifetime tenure, then they better start ruling in ways that are more pleasing to this segment of the political class. And unfortunately, it seems to have affected Chief Judge Roberts, who now has been voting instead of in the conservative way that he had been previously, is now joining with the liberals that are left on the court, and there are only three of them in many cases. And so I think this is part of the effort. And while this may not succeed, the ultimate goal here is to do away with the filibuster requirement so that they can pass legislation and do other things with just a mere majority, whereas in the Senate, at least, they now require 60 votes for most things. So this is all part and parcel of that effort, and they, keep dropping these bombs to try and get the court to come around to its view.
Do you think these are threats and a bluff? I mean, real threats or a bluff, or just a bluff?
I don't think it's a bluff. I think they're basically sending a message to the court. Look, we're serious about this, and we're going to move in these directions unless you start coming out with decisions that are more favorable to the positions we're taking. And as I said, this is one piece of it, but there's many others. We saw recently where it was, I think Senator Whitehouse proposed that there be more disclosure of membership in these groups that submit amicus briefs. That's, again, another goal that they have. They complain about dark money groups, but of course, they're funded by similar dark money groups.
Right.
And so it's really just a partisan effort to every way possible persuade the court that if they don't start ruling on these important cases in ways that the left is demanding, then they're going to take action legislatively to see if they can't achieve that result in other ways.
So you've been a judge. Did you ever see anything like this from elected officials in the executive branch or the legislative branch so overtly try to bully or influence a sitting bench of justices?
No, this is, as far as I know, unprecedented, at least certainly not at the state level. And so it's very disconcerting, to say the least, to see it happening at the federal level. And it's all born of the fact that President Trump appointed 3 judges that weren't to their liking. They resent the way that Merrick Garland, Obama's nominee, never got a vote when he was proposed at the end of President Obama's term. And that led to an appointment by President Trump that they think should have gone to Merrick Garland. And it's gone on from that point forward, and it's getting worse and worse.
So I listened to some of their press conference today, and the statements they were making about how Republicans stole the Supreme Court or stole 2 seats on the Supreme Court by taking unprecedented actions. You and I have talked about this many times on this show. Republicans did nothing unconstitutional. They did everything that was within their powers to do in both cases. In the case of Coney Barrett at the end of Trump's term, and in the case of Gorsuch at the beginning of Trump's term, and Garland at the end of Obama. I mean, there was nothing unconstitutional or illicit. Democrats may not have been happy with it, but was there anything unconstitutional in the way the Republicans acted?
Not at all. The Senate has the right to advise and consent, and that takes at least a majority vote. That doesn't require 60 votes, but they have a right to either hold a hearing or not hold a hearing, or to consent. And in the case of the Garland nomination, they decided not to consent and not to go forward with that. But that was certainly within their prerogative.
The people of this country elected a majority of Republicans at that time who have full authority during their full tenure to advise or consent or not, right?
Exactly. So, yeah, nothing unconstitutional, but obviously the Democrats didn't like it one bit.
So it turns out, so the bill that we're talking about that apparently was introduced today after the press conference would add 4 seats to the U.S. Supreme Court, which presumably, if it was passed soon, would be immediately filled by nominations from the Biden Harris ticket, whoever's going to be president at the time. And the bill in the House was led by Jerry Nadler, the radical from New York, and in the Senate, the bill sponsor is our neighbor up the road in Massachusetts, Ed Markey. Do you know much about Senator Markey?
Only that he is maybe even to the left, if that's possible, of Senator Whitehouse. So he's a Green New Dealer. He's at one with AOC and all that she's trying to accomplish on the House side. So he's a radical left member of the Senate, and this would be right up his alley.
So I'm going to ask you a political question here, not a legal one, but I'm going to use this as an example. So when you look at how the Democrats want to change the voting rules with federal control to make it easier to cheat and probably easier for illegals to vote, when you look at ending the filibuster potentially in the Senate, when you look at adding 2 Democrat senators if DC becomes a state, and now you look at hacking the Supreme Court, does it or does it not appear that the Democrats in the U.S. Congress want to rig it so that everything they want either gets ruled upon favorably or elected, or their people elected? I mean, aren't they just rigging the system here?
Well, they're certainly attempting to have things their way, and I think they're motivated in part by the idea that they have this rare confluence of power in all 3 branches of government, potentially, at least in the 2 branches of government, the executive and the legislature. Both houses are now in Democratic hands, and they realize that that may be an ephemeral, short-lived opportunity because the elections are coming up and they may lose the slim majority they have in either of the 2 houses of the legislature. So the powers that be in the Democratic Party are saying, we've got to act now because we have an opportunity here that may not be there in as short as another year.
But
so let's get going.
Yeah, but how short-sighted is that, right? When they did the nuclear option a few years ago to end 60 vote requirement for federal court appointees, Republicans said, you'll pay for this if we take control of the Senate, and they did. And when the senators took control, it said, okay, since you did that, we're going to end the 60 vote requirement for Supreme Court nominees. Now the Democrats are saying, well, because we hold that virtually zero but advantage in the Senate, we're going to add 4 justices to give us a liberal majority. Republicans, I'm sure, are going to say, hey, when we get control of the Senate, which could be in as early as a year and a half or 2, we'll unrig it and put it back in our favor. I mean, by doing this, aren't they making the Supreme Court a political football?
Absolutely. Although some would argue that it already is a political football, and nothing is a better proof of that than what goes on with these nominations. This used to be a non-event when a president appointed somebody. The only issue was whether they were qualified. Now it's all about who's appointing them and what their background is and their political and judicial philosophy. So yeah, unfortunately, it tends to politicize the court in ways that go way beyond the history of the court. There's always been some controversy about legal decisions, but now it's causing too many people to view the judges, particularly because of the appointment process, as little more than politicians in robes. And that's not what they should be.
All right. One other topic, just briefly to cover with you, and thanks for your time today, Judge. So we had on parents, and we've talked about it a few times with our next guest, Dr. Boston, and the parents, that many school districts in our state, public school districts, are requiring athletes to take a COVID test. And it's a test that's an experimental test, so doesn't have full FDA approval in order to participate in interscholastic league sports. And many parents we've had on this show and a group they formed are, I would say, outraged that their minor children are being forced to do something that they may or may not approve of. So it's a parental rights question, and they have some concerns over over a test that has not been authorized for use for asymptomatic young people. So you and I talked about this off air, but and you rightly pointed out that there is a precedent for schools to require certain other vaccines. So how does this square? Would they have? Do you think there's a potential case here, or do you think this is within the rights of school systems to make these mandates?
Well, I think the first question here is what authority do local school districts have to impose these requirements, particularly if they're selecting one group of subgroup of students, namely student athletes, out from people who participate in other joint activities at either elementary or high school level. I mean, why are we selecting out athletes?
Yeah, and they are discriminating against them because they're not requiring other students to take these
Yeah.
tests to go to school.
So why are they being singled out, and why should we have a patchwork of requirements where some districts are requiring this, others are not? Shouldn't there, if there's going to be a policy, should it be a policy that's statewide rather than leaving it up to the 39 different school districts to figure this out? So to me, the first issue is, what authorization do they have from the legislature or the Board of Education, for that matter, to venture into this area? And why are they discriminating and picking out this one subgroup of students
Yep.
for a more onerous requirement than anybody else? And as you pointed out, the fact that it's still not approved for use for young people of this kind, and hasn't really gone beyond the experimental stage, that raises further questions about its appropriateness. So I think there's a lot of fertile ground for parents to be upset about this and to press the issue with the powers that be at the state level as to whether this is the policy that we ought to allow every school district to decide for itself.
Yeah, but and it is a legal gray area because other vaccines are mandated, like the measles and things like that, right?
Well, but those are generally for all students, not a
right,
subset of them.
right.
And whatever testing is required is generally not experimental. And I don't think we
Yep.
leave that up to individual districts to decide for themselves whether to do it.
All right. So it sounds like you think there are some serious legal questions about this policy.
Yes.
Okay, good to know. All right, Judge Flanders, hey, thanks again for joining us on In the Dugout. We'll have you back on again, sure, because there's all kinds of legal stuff flying around out there right
Always
now.
a pleasure.
All right, good luck with your tennis at Dunes Club. Thanks, Judge Flanders.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, we'll have Dr. Boston, I'm sure, joining us in just a few minutes. And while we wait for him, I want to bring up another topic. Kind of goes back to just the abuse that we're seeing under this Biden campaign and the Democrats up in Congress. So let me show you this little funny. I love my funnies. So so much in this picture. First you got spending like a pig. How Sarah Palin said he put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. And when we talk about pig, when it comes to government spending, we're just talking about this voracious appetite for government to get bigger and bigger and bigger and spend more. You see the Chinese Communist and the Soviet symbols on this particular pig's arm, which I assume is the U.S. government right now, and they failed. It looks like they failed with the Green New Deal. But what they're showing here is, while many of those same provisions that were in the Green New Deal, we're going to put into this new infrastructure bill. I mean, so infrequently does anything in the title of the bill have any meaning. It's just a good sounding phrase to try to give the bill a good wrapping. But we all know that the infrastructure bill is got, just like the COVID relief bill had only 9% COVID stuff in it, right? This infrastructure bill has very limited infrastructure. And it has has a lot of Green New Deal stuff in it, which they claim is infrastructure. And it has a lot of tax increases in it. Tax increases that an independent study, from the nation's largest manufacturing association, the National Association of Manufacturers, said would likely cost 1 million manufacturing jobs. But you see, this is it. This is what socialism is. This is what liberalism and Biden and the Democrats are. They don't care about you. They don't care about jobs. They care about policies that will give them more control over your lives, period. And advancing their agenda. I don't know why, but they do. How can you pass tax increases that will cost 1 million jobs? The CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers said, in my view, these tax proposals, coupled with what we've seen out of the Senate, will trigger a second wave of U.S. companies moving their jobs and research overseas. That's what happened under Obama. And that's what Trump reversed. Companies started coming back, but now if these tax bills and this infrastructure bill passes, it's going to reverse again, and companies are going to start leaving America. Jay Timmons went on to say Biden's tax policy actually makes it better for a foreign company to operate in America than an American company to operate here at home. This policy is very dangerous to blue-collar workers. And it's just stunning how moving an agenda and ignoring all of these harmful impacts, sticking your head in the sand. We don't just see that happen with Biden and the Democrats. We see it happen here in Rhode Island. That's what happened with the Act on Climate bill. That's what happened that the General Assembly passed and the governor signed. That's what happened with this bill we mentioned earlier in the show, this rental assistance, Section 8, supposedly discrimination bill. It's not to do with discrimination, but it's bad for small business, and they ignore it because they believe the narrative. They believe the false neverland of make-believe narrative versus the reality on the ground. It's an amazing development in recent years, how this is happening, how the narrative becomes the rule, even if it's a false narrative. When nobody fact checks, nobody cares about anything but the narrative. It's really something else. So, and we see that too with COVID, right? With all these COVID policies, all these mask wearing and distancing and shutdown policies, and we see it with the and I think, as our next guest will say, the irrational promotion of all these vaccines when there might be real problems associated with them. So let's bring on our Thursday afternoon favorite, Dr. Andrew Boston. Welcome back to In the Dugout, Andy. Oh, you're muted, Andy. Not hearing you. Try again. Nope, it's all muddled. You might have to sign out and sign in again. All right, we'll have Dr. Boston back. But, I'll just set it up for you today and then have him comment. At today's weekly press conference by Governor Key and the Department of Health, the health director, Dr. Alexandra Scott, clearly was downplaying the potential severity of these Johnson and Johnson vaccine blood clot problems that have been seen in some people. Dr. Boston, are you back with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. We got you now. You're coming through now. So you weren't too happy with Dr. Nicole Alexander Scott today and the way she apparently downplayed the potential negative impacts of these J&J vaccines. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, not at all. Well, it's the usual problem, Mike. First of all, I'm not a lawyer, and you just had Judge Flanders on, but as a layman, I read the emergency use authorization statute. It's a general statute, and it would apply obviously more broadly than just to the COVID vaccines, all of which operate under EUAs.
Right.
And it makes very clear that as under EUA, they're all voluntary, and moreover, the whether it's a drug or in this case a vaccine, the patient is supposed to be presented with objective alternative therapies or options, at least. So you say in the case of a vaccine, well, what's the alternative? Well, there actually is a very concrete alternative. They should be informed that if they had a bona fide infection with COVID from which they recovered, PCR positive, a whole clinical syndrome, particularly loss of taste, God forbid, some development of a pneumonia, antibody testing positive, something that was a real bona fide infection, they should be informed, well, maybe the vaccine's not for you because the immunity that you've been conferred by having recovered from the infection is at least as robust and versatile as anything that will be able to give you artificially from the vaccine. That would be a proper element of informed consent.
Yeah, just think.
And that's never done, Mike. I mean, I just came back. Yeah, that's why I'm wearing a Miami Heat hat. I just came back from the Free Republic of Florida now under Governor DeSantis, and a couple of colleagues of ours told us, actually they're now patients of my wife, basically they drove up. They're older, they're in their 70s, and they drove up to a vaccine station across the state of Florida from Naples to Miami. And it literally amounted to rolling down the window and getting their jabs, their shots in the arms, without much in the way of informed consent at all. That's not the way an EUA is supposed to be administered.
All right, so let's think of all the commercials we see, right? And with on this medicine or that medicine, and they have to spend 30 seconds giving you all the potential side effects and potential risks associated with it. We don't have any of that with this vaccine.
And wait a minute, but also the alternatives. I mean, the alternative with an experimental vaccine is at least as important. And again, the idea that the immunity conferred by an infection from which you've recovered is at least as robust, that should be part of the consent process.
All right, so we agree that all these vaccines should have informed consent. Listen, there's a 1 in a million, whatever it is, a 1 in a million chance that you could get
like one specific one,
or you could have these side. Do you still want to take it, right?
But one specific fact that Dr. Scott cited today, and I take it at face value. She's claiming that of those vaccinated thus far, only 1%, I think she said, had any evidence of being reinfected.
0.1%, she said.
Did she say 0.1%?
0.1, yes, 0.1.
0.1%. Well, there are observational studies where the number gets that low with people who've recovered from infections. It reaches a broader range, but the point is that there's a complete downplaying or even an absence of discussion of what benefit is conferred by having previously been infected. And that's not proper in terms of informed consent. Now, getting into
so let's expand on that a second. Let's just be clear. So, because there is a school of thought out there, and I'm asking you specifically if there's any research that if you've had if you've been infected in the recent past, getting a vaccine of any kind might put you at additional risk of side effects, correct?
Right, right. And no, that's pretty well accepted
That
too.
is well accepted. Okay.
That's pretty well accepted too.
But nobody asks, right? Did you recently have the vaccine? Nobody
No, I
asks.
think they're supposed to ask that. But what I'm saying is, it should be framed in
Right.
not only as a precaution potentially, but more as at least as important as a reason. Well, maybe you don't need it. And that's
Yeah,
that's
right.
not a trivial issue, particularly when you start to move into as we're now seeing with these episodes of this rare phenomenon. Now, I want to frame this properly. What's being seen, and it's not just with, by
We're
the way,
talking about the J&J vaccine now, right?
it's not just with the J&J vaccine,
Okay.
which is an adenovirus vector vaccine. This has been described with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is also an adenovirus vector vaccine, which has now, basically been eliminated, at least in temporarily in Europe. Denmark it's the first official country to drop it altogether. But it raised a lot of red flags because of this phenomenon of not only developing clots, thromboses, but in conjunction with really lowering your levels of platelets, which can contribute to excess bleeding. So the problem, Mike, is that this is not a common syndrome. In other words, apart from vaccination, apart from this whole question of vaccination, we're talking about a rare syndrome, particularly when it comes to cerebral thromboses in the venous sinuses in the brain. This is rare for the fact that there's a signal so early with the introduction of these adenovirus vector vaccines. And by the way, some cases have been reported with the mRNA vaccines. Now they've been administered much more widely. So this phenomenon with the adenovirus vector vaccines, the AstraZeneca, now with J&J, has grabbed people's attention because it happened so quickly with relatively, comparable to the earlier vaccines, limited administration. But then you have to look at the target group, at least initially, and I want to expand on this a little bit too, which is young women. Basically, the entire range, if you include the Norwegian report that was in the New England Journal of Medicine and the FDA report that just came out, you're talking about 18 to 52 years old, these women. And it's now 11 of them, if you add the two reports together, 4 of whom have died, Mike. That's more than a third of them have died.
And those are just reported cases. There could be some unreported cases.
Exactly. And cases worked up where it's pretty definitive. So when you start to look at, just going back to the United States cases, so they say, well, Dr. Scott was sort of minimizing. It's only 6 cases. Well, it's 6 cases, but the denominator she's using is wrong, because we now see that it may be targeted to younger women, or women in this age of roughly 20 to 50. I think it's only about 1.2 to 1.4 million people, women in that range, had been vaccinated. That brings it down to 1 out of 200,000. Now, if you start to look at what is the benefit in terms of preventing COVID in that population, what is their real risk from serious complication of COVID, you start to get down to numbers where the risk of the vaccine may be completely unacceptable. And these are the real issues, Mike, which is why I think I've been consistent about this. If you were going to rush these vaccines out under emergency use authorization, then you darn well should have just focused on those where COVID itself is truly an emergency, i.e. the highest risk population. And there's some very compelling data from the UK where, let's face it, they've done a mass vaccination program as well. And Israel will be my second example. In the UK, the Public Health England published an analysis where just confined to 60 and above. And they used a model, which of course always makes me suspicious. But in their model, they claimed that 10,400 deaths had been prevented by vaccinating this population above 60. However, when you looked at the description of the results, between the ages of 60 and 69, their model claimed only 100 deaths were prevented. So in other words, out of the 10,400 deaths that the model claims were prevented by vaccination, 99% of that benefit accrued in those who were 70 plus years old.
Right.
They didn't even bother to model people under 60.
So that
And then, Mike, in Israel, a massive observational study was conducted and also published in the New England Journal of Medicine back a little while ago, at the end of February. Here, they followed over 500,000 people who'd been vaccinated, matched to another equal group unvaccinated, 1-to-1. So over 1 million people observed, and with 42-day follow-up. What they found was that because this was already during a period when Israel was vaccinating, down to the age of 16 to 18 or so, that the beneficial effect in terms of COVID mortality was heavily diluted already. It took them, you had to vaccinate 28,000 people to prevent one COVID death. Now, I bet you that would have been a lot more favorable if it had just been looking at people who were 60 plus or 65 plus. But the point is, Mike, you're diluting the benefit in terms of preventing COVID death by vaccinating all these low risk people.
So the summary. So I got two questions here. First, as I've been claiming from the beginning, and as I would agree, in the very first weeks, remember the 2 weeks to flatten the curve thing, you might argue that was okay because we didn't want to overwhelm the medical system with severe cases, right? People who are really sick or could die, right? That was it. It then shifted to preventing spread and counting cases, and that was the mistake. Everything, whether it's these vaccines for younger people and healthier people and these tests for these athletes, everything is now wrongly focused, in my view, on trying to stop the spread of cases rather than protect the most vulnerable from severe illness. I mean, so right from the beginning, after the first 2 weeks, I think every government entity and everybody else has been off. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think in terms of where we are right now, because we can't undo what's been done, the latest numbers for Rhode Island are that 88.3% of those 65 plus have been at least partially vaccinated, and 79.1% have been fully vaccinated. And there is nothing going on in Rhode Island right now. Today's positivity rate, I think, was 1.9%.
All right, we're going to look at that in a second. I might challenge you on that a little bit. We're going to look at that in a second. But let me ask this. So you agree with the CDC putting the pause on the J&J?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They had to.
Okay.
They had to.
And you disagree with Nicole Alexander Scott downplaying the potential
absolutely.
There, right?
This is not happening in a vacuum, Mike. I mean, to ignore what's going on with AstraZeneca is just inappropriate. I mean, it's the same platform. They're both adenovirus vector vaccines.
All right. Let's look at, you mentioned what's going on here in Rhode Island. So let's take a look at that, and let me ask you some questions. So we're going to look at some data on the WPRI website. And we'll just quickly go through these 4 or 5 charts here. Okay. So first, so the number of new cases is up. So what did I do here? Here we go. The number of new cases has gone up slightly, but it's kind of leveled. Okay.
But not the percentages, Mike.
No, I know. We're going to look at that in a second. The deaths have very low right now.
Very low.
Hospitalizations rose a little, now seem to be back down. New hospital admissions are going back down again. Intensive care, though, has gone up rather sharply. What do you make of that?
A little bit. I don't. We'll see. That went up a little bit.
All right, so something to keep an eye on, right?
Right.
And then, as you said, the positivity rate has largely stayed in the 2-point range. Today it was 1.9.
Right.
Yesterday's data, and you think that's the key one?
Well, I think you look at the totality of the evidence, and it's been stable like this for a long time now, particularly the positivity rate. So no, I think we're in a good place. And Mike, I was just looking at New Hampshire for comparison because Governor Sununu announced that as he put it, wicked soon they're going to drop the mask mandate. Their 7-day positivity recently was 5.3%. And that's not different than, say, recently looked at Georgia.
That would cause panic around here.
Yeah, exactly. And despite these new positives, they're mostly occurring outside the long-term care facilities, which drove 68% of their deaths. Now, that's not too dissimilar to Rhode Island, where it's hovered in the 60% plus range for the entire pandemic. So when you see the infections coming down dramatically in the high-risk populations, and now so many of them have been vaccinated, those are positive things. And there's no justification for the emergency still being in place, and for the mask mandate still being in place. The mask mandate is, as you and I have discussed ad nauseum, is a separate issue because there's certainly no randomized controlled trial evidence that masks even work in the community setting. But beyond that, we're in a stable place. The vulnerable population has been largely vaccinated, and it's time to open the state up.
All right. So let me just push back a little and just ask. Now, I'm not pushing back. I'm just asking. So there was a headline in another paper today. So while we have a low positivity rate, because we take so many tests, we're identifying a lot of cases,
right?
Which puts us as the second most cases per capita in the country. Does that bother you in any way?
Not in the least. And again, they're not. It's not. It would be nice to stratify where these are occurring. Although you're getting the information from Dr. Scott that they're occurring in young people,
right?
Where it's the most benign.
And that's why, as we agreed earlier, the folly of counting cases. Counting cases tells you virtually nothing.
It's a function of testing, and we have led the country in testing. We've led the country in testing. We've led the country in masking. We have the fourth highest per capita mortality. Those strategies, I think the numbers would tell us, the bottom line number would tell us that they were not terribly successful.
And the one thing I'll give Dr. Scott some credit on today, she did mention, hey, you might question how come we're seeing, increase in cases, but yet a decrease in deaths. And she said, because most of those cases are occurring in younger, healthier people.
She did mention that. No, but the point is that I've never agreed with this massive asymptomatic testing. It's just inappropriate. You don't know what you're really getting. And we raised the issue collectively of the issue of cycle thresholds. We showed how valuable those data could be, and yet they still won't publicize them.
All right. So here's just a few quick questions that people have asked me to ask you. Don't have much time, so we'll get through them quickly. So if the J&J comes back and the CDC releases the pause, do you have a recommendation on it?
Well, it certainly looks like women under 55 shouldn't take it, shouldn't get it. It shouldn't be given to them. Okay. I mean, that's what it looks like right now. And I have to tell you, there are other cases of this syndrome that are not just occurring in women and are frankly not just occurring with the adenovirus vector vaccines. Now, these are signals that are not as intense as what happened with J&J and with AZ,
okay.
but they need to be looked at. All this stuff needs to be looked at.
Right.
Mike, it's a fundamental principle that you open up a can of worms when you start willy-nilly vaccinating people that are very low risk for serious consequences from COVID.
All right. And on the Moderna and Pfizer, which is a different kind of vaccine, people have asked, do you recommend if getting both shots, or is just one good enough?
It doesn't look like there's a huge increase in the immunity that's conferred with the two injections. The data that I've seen are pretty consistent that it could be as high as 80% reduction in your risk of infection by getting the first inoculation alone. But the problem is, Mike, that these are not the only equations that we should be looking at. Were you previously infected? Are you in a low risk group for serious complications?
Right.
Those are the individual decisions that should be made.
So
But it's like the cat's out of the bag already. We're into this mass vaccination strategy unchallenged, and you're a Robert Kennedy Jr. anti-vaxxer if you question the rationality of this strategy. And there was a very good Wall Street Journal op-ed on it by two outstanding infectious disease epidemiologists, one from Stanford, one from Harvard, which the money line to me was that it's just as irrational to recommend that everyone get vaccinated as it is to recommend that no one get vaccinated.
So would it be fair to say that in that second question, should you get the second Pfizer or Moderna dose, you would say that the severity or the degree to which you would say yes depends on your risk, right?
That would be the most rational way to approach it. If you're at really high risk for serious complications from COVID, maybe it's worth getting both injections, if that, even for the small increment in protection that you may be afforded.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a puzzle. I mean, was it 80% to 90% increase by getting one versus two or something?
It looks to be pretty consistently, about 80%. I've seen numbers that reanalyzed some clinical trial data from Pfizer, which showed it could be 90%. But field study data looks closer to 80%.
And is there greater risk of a side effect or a reaction, adverse reaction to the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine with the second dose, or are they equally spread out between the two doses?
No, it looks as if the risk is a little higher with the augmented response that you would get from the second dose. Although I'm honestly not familiar with how quantified that is, but that's my sense, is that it's ostensibly a little bit riskier to go through both. It may also be a function of the two independent probabilities.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Andrew Boston, thanks again. Great advice, great insight on all this, and we'll look forward to I'm glad you're back safely from Florida, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next week and following this J&J little drama that's going on out there.
Yeah, Mike, my bottom line is to parents is that, again, with a rare exception, maybe a kid with cystic fibrosis or something like that, a kid who's immunocompromised, I would stay away from all of these vaccines for children until a lot more is known. And frankly, what we do know is that COVID affects children less than the flu does. That is clear now. And bear that in mind, when you're rushing out to vaccinate children or having it mandated upon them in college.
All right, Andy, thanks again. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye.
Good. Dr. Andrew Boston, folks. I think it's one of the things we're proud on this show. I think we helped launch awareness of Dr. Boston's non-conventional wisdom point of view. He's been a regular guest on local talk shows. I know Channel 12 interviewed him recently. They haven't ran the piece yet. Twitter account's up, and you heard him first on this show, right? This show in the dugout was the first to bring you this non-conventional wisdom, epidemiologic thought process. That's what we do on this show. We challenge the conventional wisdom. We challenge the status quo. Sometimes we might not be right, but I think most of the time we are, and you're going to hear it from us first on this show. So keep tuning in. Whatever the big topic of the day is, nationally or locally, we're going to look to challenge the status quo narrative, because so much in our society today, so much policy, so much of the culture wars and the cancel culture are all based on false narratives that must be challenged. We're probably not in a position to dispel them on a national basis, but we can challenge them, so at least you're informed that there's another way to look at some of these things. That's what we do. That's what good debate is about. That's what informed consent is about, which, when we talk about taking a test or a vaccine, we need an informed citizenry, and they need to hear both sides of the story, and we're going to give that to you. So keep watching and in the dugout. We'll see you